everyone, so I'm Nina and I'm a horticultural research technician here at Kayanase Ecological Restoration and Native Plant Nursery. Part of what we do here is growing native plants, and part of growing native plants is stratifying their seeds. So today's video is going to be all about stratification. Before we get into any technical details or specific examples, I just want to talk about what stratification actually is and why native plants need it. Here in southern Ontario, our wild plants get exposed to some pretty cold temperatures in the winter time, and our native plants will go dormant and then they'll re-emerge in the spring. However, it's not just those grown plants that have adapted to have this dormancy in the winter time. A lot of their seeds, once they're mature, also require this dormancy or winter cold period in order to break that dormancy and help them germinate in the spring. Here at the nursery, we kind of mimic that cold winter period, and this is what we call stratification. So most native seeds will require this cold, moist stratification where we expose the seeds to a moist medium, which we'll talk about some examples of different media that you can use, and then expose them to cold temperatures. This is usually 4 degrees Celsius. So you can use your fridge, or here at the nursery we have a walk-in cooler. So we're going to talk about some different types of media, but before we get into that, we're going to just talk about various different native plants. So we have some examples that we'll go over today, but basically every native plant has a different requirement for its stratification. So different timelines and different treatments. The ones that we're going to talk about today are just kind of basic stratification, but there are some that have more or less complex stratification procedures. So there are some plants, a lot of our grasses, that don't require stratification at all. On the other hand, there are some more complex seeds that require multiple exposures to cold moist. These are ones that in the wild might take 2 years to germinate. We're not going to go into the details on that. And then some other complex treatments for germination can include scarification, which is for a lot of our legumes or seeds with really hard seed coats. So these are ones that we would scarify mechanically. So we would use sandpaper or boiling water, or some people even use acid in order to break through that seed coat and allow the seed to germinate. Now, as I mentioned, we're not going to talk about all those different treatments. We're just going to focus on one. The first example that we're going to go through is Wild Columbine. So Wild Columbine is pretty common in southern Ontario. It's a herbaceous plant that likes to grow in the shade, and it has a pretty basic stratification requirement, so about 60 days in the cold, moist. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to put it into that stratification media. So here at the nursery, because we do grow a larger quantity, we use plug trays. But at home, obviously, you can grow them in various different pots, containers, or plug trays. And we actually stratify our seed directly into the germination tray. Now, there are different options if you're doing this from home, which we'll talk about as well. But right now, we just have a germination tray filled with propagation mix. And we have moistened the soil. Moisture is very important when you're stratifying your seeds. So you want your media to be moistened to the point where it kind of clumps in your hand, but it doesn't fall apart too much. So you don't want it to be soaking wet, but you also don't want it to be falling apart completely. And this will allow your seed to have that moist exposure. So for our columbine, we're just going to put it right in the propagation mix. And after we have sown those seeds, we put our germination trays in plastic bags and then place them in our cooler. So you definitely don't have to use propagation mix. Some other options are peat moss, which is not the most sustainable. So some better options might be sand, vermiculite, perlite, or you can even use a paper towel. So now we are just going through the paper towel method. So here I have some pre-moistened paper towel. Again, you want to moisten it to the point where it'll kind of clump together, but it's not dripping wet with water. And then I'm just going to sprinkle my seeds over the paper towel. And there's a couple ways you can do it. You can put a stack of paper towel on top of these seeds, or I just like to roll up the paper towel with the seeds in it, and then this just makes sure that the seeds are exposed to moisture on all sides. And I put this in a baggie. Again, I'm going to seal it almost to the end, just leaving a small little space for my pinky finger like that. And this can go in the cooler. With any of those media, a good rule of thumb is to add about double the amount of media to the amount of seeds that you have. And if you're going to be using those media at home, you can just put the media right into a plastic baggie. We're going to put in about double the amount of moistened stratification media. This is just our propagation mix, but as I mentioned, you can use various different media there. I'm just going to put in, there we go. This should be more than enough. That will be enough to make sure that the seeds are exposed to moisture. And then I'm going to seal this, just leaving a small little space about the size of my pinky finger. And then this can go in the cooler for the 60 days stratification. So after your 60 days are up, or however many days for your stratification, we pull our germination trays right out of the cooler and put them into a bright, sunny location. So if you're growing these in your house, you could put them in a window. If you're growing them outside, you could put it in an area that doesn't have too much wind and doesn't have, scorching hot sun. You want to make sure that that media stays consistently moist. That's the most important thing at this stage. Then you're going to wait for it to germinate, keeping it consistently moist. So a good rule of thumb is to plant your seed about double the depth that the seed is wide. So with your acorn, we're going to go for about 1.5 to 2 inches deep. And after you've sown your seed, covered the soil back up, then we're going to, again, put it in a location that doesn't get too much wind, but still has enough sun to allow it to germinate. Some seeds actually require the light to germinate, so a lot of those really small seeds might require sowing on the surface, and those, of course, will need the sun to germinate as well. So usually about 2 weeks or so, 2 weeks to a month later, you'll start to see germination. So we have some examples here of another 2 species that we carry in the greenhouse. So this is swamp milkweed. Over here we have sweet oxeye. So they've both been exposed to their cold, moist stratification period. And the first thing that you will see are seed leaves, or these are otherwise called cotyledons. And yeah, at that point you have grown an established seedling from seed after the cold, moist stratification period.